Okay, so last week we spent looking at the different plans of government and proposals for government in this constitutional convention. We looked at the Federalists and how they supported this Virginia plan. We looked at the Anti-Federalists and their politics and their policies behind the New Jersey plan. And then we also started talking about something called a compromise. And that was one of your vocab words last week, was compromise. And a compromise is when two parties come together and try to reach an agreement where each party or each group gives up a little something of what they are wanting in order to get something better in return, and have parts of what they are hoping for, but also the other side gets parts of what they want. So this great compromise was reached at this constitutional convention that kind of blended both the Virginia and the New Jersey plans. So it called for, this new constitution basically said we were going to have a stronger federal government, stronger than what we had under the Articles of Confederation, that had three separate but equal branches. And again, since both plans, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan, wanted three branches of government, that was easy. Now, in terms of how many lawmaking houses there were going to be, they pulled this from the Virginia plan and said we're going to have a bicameral or a two-house legislature. So those two houses would be the Senate, where representation among all states would be equal, and this was known as the upper house. So the Senate has a little bit more authority and has a little bit more responsibility than the House of Representatives does. And so two representatives come from each state. So at the time, there were 12 states, and then once Rhode Island ratified, they became 13 states in this union. Today we have 50. So there are currently 100 total senators, 2 from each state. So whether you're California, which has the most amount of people of any state, or whether you are Montana, which has the lowest population, both of those states are equally represented in the Senate with 2 members. Now, in the lower house of the legislative branch, the House of Representatives, representation here would be based on population. So in other words, states that had a greater population would have more House representatives. So in our example, Virginia had more people than Rhode Island did. So at that time, Virginia was going to have more members in this second house, the House of Representatives, than Rhode Island would. Even though both states had 2 representatives in the Senate, Virginia, because they had a higher population, would have more representatives in the House than Rhode Island would. Now, individual states had more power under the Articles of Confederation, and that's something that smaller states like New Jersey and Rhode Island and Connecticut didn't like to give up, but they were kind of outnumbered here. And sometimes when you realize that it's a battle that you're not going to win, you have to kind of turn about and make the most of it as best you can. So again, how does this great compromise look? In the legislative branch, we have the lawmaking Congress, which is split up into 2 groups, the House and the Senate being the upper house based on equal representation, and the House of Representatives being the lower house, and that's decided based on the state's population. So also things that were discussed at this constitutional convention. One was the slavery issue. So you had certain states that were starting to think that slavery was unnecessary. States like Massachusetts and Pennsylvania, who really did away with slaves in their states and said, we don't really need these anymore. We don't know if this is a country that should have slavery that is legal. But then you had largely populated states like Virginia and Georgia and South Carolina, all in the South, where slavery was needed and necessary. They said, no, we don't want to do anything with the slavery issue. We want to be able to keep slaves if a state wants to have slaves. If you don't want to have slaves in the North, that's fine. But we don't think that we should make a universal law that says that slavery is legal or illegal. And so what they did is they basically said that we're going to push this slavery issue aside, and we're not going to do anything with it for about 20 years. And again, if you look at the differing economies, in the North, they were going to be more so manufacturing and making things with your hands, and also fishing. Whereas in the South, most of the way that they made money was through farming and agriculture. And so that's where slavery was more of a necessity in the South than it was in the North. Doesn't mean that it was right, doesn't mean that it was moral, but it means that the people in the South felt that if slavery was taken away from them, then they would lose a lot of money. But in terms of how would a slave count in terms of representation, northern states said, well, we don't really have many slaves, so we don't think that we should get fewer representatives in Congress just because we don't have that many slaves, and many of them are being shipped into the South because they're purchasing them from overseas. So what the delegates at this constitutional convention said was, why don't we make each slave represented as 3/5 of a person in terms of population. So they said that for every 5 slaves that there were in a state, only 3 of them would count in that state's population. That way, in states like Georgia and South Carolina, where they actually had more slaves than they had white citizens, they would not be able to bring in more slaves and say, aha, we've got more people now, and so therefore we can have more representatives. Northern states were saying, if you're going to count them as people in population, then you should treat them as people and let them go and not use them as slaves. So the agreement or the compromise was this 3/5 compromise. So in other words, if a state had 5,000 slaves, only 3,000 of them would count as a person in population. And like we said, Congress agreed not to make any law regarding slavery for 20 years. So they said, since we can't come to a consensus on this slavery issue, should it be legal, should it be illegal among all the states, we're going to just put it off the table for 20 years. And by 1807, then we can bring it up again. And they certainly did. So by 1808, they decided that no more slaves could be brought in. But that didn't stop Southern states from encouraging procreation and reproduction of slaves through slave families. In other words, they were saying to their slaves, have babies, and those babies then can grow up to be slaves. So it was a smart economic decision, but in terms of humanity and in terms of how to treat a person, it was downright disgusting. Other important issues: what are we going to do about individual rights and states' rights? Are states going to have certain rights still? Are individuals going to have certain rights? What are we going to do about foreign affairs? How do we handle problems with other countries? And then also, with this new president that we're going to have, how are we going to elect this president? Is it going to be decided in Congress? Are we going to put a vote to the people? And how long is their term going to be? And we'll talk about all this as we get going. And then ratification. So how do we determine whether we're going to approve something or deny something? What's it going to be? Do we need 75% of the vote? Do we need 66% of the vote? So those are other important issues that were discussed. Now, one thing that Anti-Federalists said before they could do anything further was, we want a Bill of Rights. So there's that question of, what do we do about individual rights? What do we do about human rights? And so they said, we can't trust that governments today or governments in the future are going to abide by the things that we want now. We want them in writing, because if you have it in writing, that stands the test of time until it is officially changed. So regardless of whether a new president comes in or a new Congress comes in, if it's in writing, they have to abide by those rules and those laws until it's officially changed. So with this Bill of Rights, they wanted them spelled out. They wanted guaranteed. And these Bill of Rights reflected the concepts of limited government. So Anti-Federalists said, we want to ensure that our government's going to be limited. We don't want to give them the power to do whatever they can, whatever they want, whenever they want to. We want our basic freedoms protected. So life, liberty, and property, the things that John Locke and Voltaire and de Montesquieu talked about, we want protections of those basic freedoms. And then also, they said, we're afraid that a government that becomes too strong is going to overtake us, just like England did, and just like England oppressed us and prevented us from having those liberties and those civil freedoms that we wanted so much. So basically, the Bill of Rights was a way to limit the power of the federal government. And these Bill of Rights, or these amendments, included things like freedom of expression, freedom of religion, to practice whatever religion you want without persecution. If you're accused of a crime, certain rights that you have, even if you look guilty and if a bunch of people say, yeah, we saw you do it, or yeah, we think you're a bad person, regardless of how innocent or how guilty you may seem, people accused of a crime have certain rights. Protection against illegal search and seizures, so protection from the government and the police and law enforcement going into your house or going into your property, even if it's on you, your person, there's protections against that. They can only do it with certain cause. And then also protection against unfair punishment. So if you are found guilty of a crime, whether you're truly guilty or whether you were framed, there are protections against how you can be punished. So the 8th Amendment, for example, gives us a protection against unfair punishment and unfair bail.